You know the moment. You're at the pharmacy, prescription in hand, and the pharmacist asks, "Is the generic okay?" It's a simple question, but it gets at something huge. Are they really the same? We're going to dive deep and figure that out.
This is it, right? This is the question we all have. You see that lower price tag, and it's definitely tempting. But there's always that little voice in the back of your head going, wait a minute, is this really just as safe? Is it going to work just as well?
To get why this is such a big deal, you just have to follow the money. I mean, look at this number. Back in 1994, generic drugs were already saving Americans $8 to $10 billion a year. And that was decades ago. You can only imagine what that number is today. This massive cost saving is literally the whole point.
So, how in the world are these huge savings even possible? Well, it all comes down to a totally different and way more streamlined path to getting these drugs on the market. Let's take a look at how that actually works. Okay, so a brand new drug has to go through this incredibly long, difficult, and super expensive road to approval. They file what's called a new drug application, or NDA, and it involves years and years of clinical trials. But a generic company? They get a shortcut. They get to file an abbreviated new drug application, or ANDA. It is a much, much lower hurdle to clear, and that right there is where all the savings begin.
And here's the absolute key. Generic drug makers get to skip all of those massive, expensive clinical trials. Their only job, their one and only job, is to prove that their product is therapeutically equivalent to the original. So, what on earth does that actually mean? Well, the FDA has this whole system figured out. You can almost think of it like an equation, a kind of equivalence equation. It's the scientific bedrock that our entire trust in generics is built on. And it's got three main parts.
First up, you have Pharmaceutical Equivalence, or PE. This part's pretty straightforward. It basically just means the generic has to have the exact same active ingredient in the exact same amount and be in the exact same form. So a tablet for a tablet, a capsule for a capsule. This is all about what the drug is.
Okay, second part, bioequivalence, or BE. Now this gets a little more complex. It's not just about what the drug is, it's about what it does once it's inside your body. The generic has to prove that it gets absorbed into your bloodstream at the same speed and in the same amount as the original brand name drug.
So, when a drug company proves both of those things, that it's pharmaceutically equivalent and bioequivalent, bam, the FDA gives it the official seal of approval, therapeutic equivalence, or TE. This is the green light that tells your pharmacist they can swap out the brand for the generic because it's expected to have the exact same clinical effect.
So there you have it. PE plus BE equals TE. This little formula is the engine that drives the entire multi-billion-dollar generic drug industry. It's an elegant, powerful, and cost-saving assumption. But, and you knew there was a but coming, what if there's some fine print to that assumption?
And this is where the story gets really interesting. Because it turns out that equivalent doesn't always mean identical. And those small, almost invisible differences can, in some rare cases, have some pretty big consequences.
This quote really nails it. While the active ingredient has to be a perfect match, all the inactive stuff, the binders, the fillers, the dyes that give it color, those can be totally different. And that flexibility, that little bit of wiggle room, is where potential problems can start to creep in.
So what kind of differences are we even talking about here? Well, for one, you have things called polymorphs. It sounds complicated, but it just means the active ingredient itself can form different crystal structures, and that can change how fast a pill dissolves. Then there are impurities. Different factories, different chemical processes, you can get different byproducts. And finally, you have those excipients we just mentioned, all that extra stuff that can be different.
Okay, so this all sounds pretty theoretical, right? Polymorphs and excipients, but does it actually matter in the real world for real patients? Well, unfortunately, there are documented cases where the answer has been a resounding yes. So let's tell a little story. It's a case study involving an antibiotic called cefuroxime. It's a drug often used to prevent infections after a patient has surgery.
Okay, so picture this. A hospital decides to switch to a generic version of this antibiotic to save some money. Makes perfect sense. But then a weird pattern emerges. Post-surgical infections start to spike. Confused, they switch back to the brand name drug, and just like that, the infection rate drops back to normal. But they're scientists, so they test it one more time. They cautiously bring the generic back, and what do you know? The infections come right back again.
So what in the world was going on? Well, when investigators dug into it, they found the culprit. It was all about chemical stability.
The generic version was basically breaking down in the IV solution before it even got to the patient. It was becoming less potent by the minute. This highlights a critical blind spot in the model, a tiny, subtle difference that had a very serious clinical outcome.
And look, this cefuroxime case wasn't just some bizarre one-off fluke. There have been other documented failures of equivalence with some really important drugs, things like the powerful antibiotic vancomycin, and even some critical anti-seizure medications, where even a tiny change can have a devastating effect. Now, these events are rare, for sure, but they prove the system isn't perfect.
So, this all brings us back to the big picture, right? The whole system is really a balancing act. It's a trade-off between the undeniable benefit of saving money and that constant quest for absolute certainty in medicine.
Here's the difference in a nutshell. A brand-name drug's promise is backed by those massive, expensive trials in actual patients. A generic drug's promise is that it's equivalent to that first drug. The core assumption is that this equivalence automatically guarantees the same medical result. But as we just saw, that assumption, while true an overwhelming majority of the time, is not infallible.
This quote from the source material is pretty eye-opening, isn't it? It suggests that maybe, just maybe, these failures happen more often than we think. Because when a drug doesn't work as expected, it's so easy to blame the patient's condition or some other factor, not the drug itself.
So where does all this leave us? Well, the takeaway is this. The system for approving generic drugs is frankly a modern marvel. It has made medicine affordable for millions and saved our healthcare system trillions of dollars. It works extremely well almost all of the time. But we have to remember it's all based on a scientific model, a brilliant and effective one, yes, but a model with known, if very rare, limitations.
Which leaves us with one last crucial question to think about. When we're balancing the massive, undeniable good of affordable medicine against the small but very real risk of one of these failures, how do we decide when we have enough certainty? It's a complex question, and it gets right to the very heart of modern medicine.